Good evening. It's good to be back and to see everybody. We are going to be continuing our series of lessons that we began a couple months ago now on authority. And we are in the third lesson, and I don't want to take too much time with the introduction and recap because I do have a lot of stuff that I want to get over, and I know I have so much stuff that I want to get over that I won't make it through everything that I would like to. But hopefully what we will talk about will be sufficient. So we're going to just quickly go over what we have already talked about. So what we've talked about so far is basically Jesus has all authority, right? And He has passed that authority on to others, in so much as He has given us, and He gave His apostles and the first century Christians and writers of the Gospels authority to write down basically what He said, right? What God has commanded. He doesn't just pass on authority to say do whatever you want or teach whatever you want, but He has told us what we can do, what we can teach, and we have the authority then to continue to teach that to others. So He's passed some of that on in that sense. We talked about general specific authority as well as the laws of exclusion and expediencies, which we'll try to, again, cover more of that in a specific example tonight. And then the last time that I was here, we kind of finished up with talking about direct command, approved example, and forced conclusion. And again, when we look at instrumental music tonight, we're going to look at it in that vein. Okay, what's the direct commands from God about music and worship? What are the approved examples, and what are our forced conclusions about that? And then last we'll look at the expediency of it. Is instrumental music, is it an expedient to our command to sing? So that will kind of be the format of the lesson for tonight. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, we're told there basically to make a defense or how we ought to act, right? So in verse 15, but in case I am delayed, I write to you so that you may know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God. So there is a certain way in which we are to conduct ourselves when we're worshiping together. And again, as we'll talk about later, we are looking at the collective worship. We're not looking at instrumental music in the sense of, can I listen to instrumental music when I go home? When I'm on my own time, we're not looking at that. It is when we gather together our collective worship to God, because there is a difference, and we'll talk about that probably next time a little bit, at least touch on that, that there is a difference between what I can do as an individual and what we can do collectively as a church group. And so as we discuss some of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight, has anyone ever heard somebody say of instrumental music, well, David did it, so it should be okay for us, right? Because David used instrumental music, we should be able to use instrumental music. So again, I'd say be careful about that. And we'll discuss some of this later. Did David use instrumental music in worship in the collective? Well, who were the singers? Who were the players of instrument in the Old Testament with the temple worship? What tribe was set aside for that specific purpose, to be the singers, to be the players of the music? Tribe of Levi, right? So, was David of the tribe of Levi? No. Okay, so again, when somebody says, well, David did it, well, David may have played an instrument, but as far as our worship is concerned, or their worship is concerned, I don't believe that he ever did, and we'll talk about that. Again, instrumental music authorized in the Old Testament. I'll ask this question: is instrumental music authorized in the Old Testament? You're looking at me like I'm asking you a trick question here. What are your thoughts?
Not authorized by God, I don't think, but David set aside certain musical instruments to be used.
Okay, that's the key, right? God, even in the Old Testament, it is under the direction of David, but David is saying, I am working under the authority of God. So it was God directed, God approved, but there were only 3 instruments that God gave them, right? And so we're going to look at an example of that 400 some years later, no new instruments, right? The same 3 instruments that God had told them to use. So would we say that God allows us to eat and drink? God authorizes us to eat and drink in our worship today. Well, why wouldn't we say that, right? Because we eat and drink, don't we, on the Lord's Day? Right, but that doesn't mean that God authorizes us to eat and drink, right? He has given us unleavened bread and fruit of the vine that we can eat and drink, and it's for a specific purpose. It is the same thing with musical instruments in the Old Testament. He authorized 3, right? But most people will say, well, they were playing instruments of music, so we should be able to play instruments of music today. And my rebuttal to them is, if you can play instrumental music in worship, and you're using the Old Testament as a guide, then it needs to be those 3 instruments: the harp, the lyre, and the cymbals. Those were the 3 things that he authorized. Now, a 4th was introduced later, and that was the trumpet, but most believe that that was for the sounding of, they used the trumpet a lot in battle because it was a loud instrument, and everyone could hear it, and so 1 blast would mean this, 2 blasts would mean this, a long blast was this, short blast was this. So they used it to kind of direct where to go and what to do in their worship in the Old Testament. So that 4th one, the trumpet, was added a little bit later, but the harp, the lyre, and the cymbals. Now, again, if you're claiming that you're using the Old Testament as your, guide to say this is how we should sing in our worship today, then it should still be those 3 instruments that you're using, because God hasn't changed His mind on that if that's what you're using. And so, again, that's something that we can ask our religious friends about when they ask us about why we don't use instrumental music in our worship. We also have some things like excuses, maybe like it sounds better. And I promise you, most instruments of music probably sound better than my voice. Now, again, I have sung in a quartet for 20-some years, and so I don't think I have a terrible voice, but certainly there are instruments of music that probably can hold a better tune or sound better when somebody plays it than my voice. But that's not what God wants, right? He wants to hear from me no matter how bad my voice is. He wants to hear from you no matter how bad your voice is. He gave us this instrument, and that's the one that He wants us to use. And then we hear the excuse sometimes, well, God didn't tell us not to, right? And so, again, we're going to try to look at that and what we are authorized to do in our lesson tonight. So, what we're trying to do is just help other people understand, right? Because one of the first questions you'll get when somebody from another religious background gets comfortable with you and they find out you're from the Church of Christ, they'll say something along the lines of, all right, what's with using no instruments of music in worship? All right, this is one of the first questions you'll get because it's one of the glaring differences between us and most other denominations, most other bodies, right? We don't use instrumentation when we sing, and most everyone else does. And so they're asking those questions, well, why aren't you guys using it, right? And so we want them to understand we're not just trying to be different, right? This is about authority. We're not just trying to be different. In fact, there are many times where I will tell them, in some of those cases, I agree with you. Sometimes the instruments do sound better than my voice. I'm not debating that. I'm just saying this is what God has authorized us to do. And we're not just trying to be different. We're just trying to follow what God has authorized us to do. And again, trying to get people to see and understand that we don't think we're better than you, okay? Because we don't use instrument and you do. It's all about authority and what we are authorized to do by God today. So it's also not just to help other people understand, but to help us understand also. Sometimes we can fall into a trap, and I can remember when I was young, my friends, 6th, 7th grade, right, asking me if they come to church with us and say, well, you know, we have a piano or an organ in our church. Why don't you have one? And my response a lot was, well, we've just never had one, right? We've just always done it this way, and this, you know, we don't really know maybe how to answer it properly. It's just this is the way that we've always done it, and so it's kind of like tradition, and that doesn't teach, right? Okay, well, that's their tradition. This is our tradition, so everything should be okay. You do it your way, we'll do it ours, and we should be able to answer those questions. And I think it helps us. Hopefully, by the end, it will help us to understand and appreciate why it is we do what we do as far as God's authority is concerned when it comes to music. It will help us appreciate our singing much, much better. All right, any thoughts or comments before we dive in?
Hank,
Good.
if you're going to have music and you're taking the Old Testament, then you're going to have to be a Levi and a Jew.
That's right. And there's a lot of other stuff you're going to have to bring with it too, right? Because we can't just pick and choose which parts of the Old Testament that we want. If you're going to follow it, you got to follow it, right? Don't pick and choose. And I think the same thing in the New Testament. We can't pick and choose what things we like. Love your neighbor, awesome. Everybody can do that. Love your enemies, that's a little bit more difficult. I'm going to leave that part out, right? That we can't do that, right? We can't pick and choose. So again, good point. If we're going to take one piece of it, we got to take all of it, and we've got to fall into the correct parameters. We got to be a Levite. We got to be a Jew, and so good points. Any other thoughts or comments there? All right, so let's look at the direct commands. And again, I'm going to try to go through these fairly quickly. I don't want to go too quickly, but fairly quickly. In Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 15, and let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called into one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ richly dwell within you, with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. And whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father. So here's a direct command from God that tells us to what? Teach one another. How?
In our hearts.
Yeah. Right. Through song, through singing, and that's the instrument, right? We're going to point that out. The instrument that God tells us to use in following this command to teach through song, he tells us the instrument that you're using is your heart. Okay, so that's what we're plucking, right? That's what and I'm not going to go into a deep dive into what solo means and all of that we've probably heard before, but it literally just means to pluck, but God gives us what the instrument is. Same thing in Ephesians chapter 5, and we'll just read verse 19. That's the one we're going to pull out. But again, he says, speaking to one another. So the last one says basically teach and admonish with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Now he says, speak to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks for all things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ to God, even the Father. So, do we have a direct command to sing? Sure. Now, let me ask you this. We talk about the heart, right? That's the instrument that we're using. And sometimes we use these, funny phrases, right? That God said, use the heart, not the harp, or something along those lines. I want to do something for a minute, and I want to put harp in here. Now, bear with me. I'm not trying to change God's law or God's rule, but I do want to make a point. So let's throw harp in there instead of heart. So, verse 19, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your harp to the Lord. Who is that command for? You. That's right. Who else? Everyone else too, right? So what does that mean? We don't have to bring a lot of harps in here, right? That command is not just for one person and everybody else to sing along. If we read it that way, if that's what you're telling me, if you're saying that this means an instrument of music, then we all need to play one, because it's not just for one person, right? So if we substitute back in the heart, it's easier to include everybody, right? Because the songs aren't going to hit the same to you as they are to me, right? We're going to be singing, and I'm singing with my heart, you're singing with your heart, and a song may hit you differently. It may bring me joy, but it may bring you terrible sorrow. The same song. Music is incredible in that way, that it just depends on what our mood is. Does that mean that we're not worshiping together? No, not at all. We're still singing, right? We're still making melody in our heart. We're still singing together the same words. But now imagine if that was a harp and you're playing a different song than I'm playing. Chaos, right? So we know the words. We're looking at the words. It may hit you differently than it hits me. But again, these commands are for all of us, not just one person and everybody else sings along. If we are truly saying that this is, instrumental music is allowed, then everyone needs to be playing those instruments of music. All right, James chapter 5 and verse 13. Is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing praises. Again, I think this is a direct command to us to sing praises to God. Right? This one especially is all about giving thanks to God. If you're happy, give thanks, give glory to God. One of the guys I used to work with when I was just out of high school, Carl Lewis, most of you probably know at least of Carl from Barnesville. And I'm telling you, the guy couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, and he didn't know the words to all the songs. And sometimes he would sing words of one song to the tune of another song. But I promise you, that man sings hymns all day long at work, right? And I think this is why. He was happy, right? He was doing something that he loved to do. He was around people that probably didn't understand why he was singing what he was singing. And I'm telling you, there were times when I tried to join in and sing along with him, but the words went the wrong way or the tune went the wrong way. But that man was making a joyful noise to the Lord, right? And it was constant. And I think this is why. He was happy, right? He was joyous, and so he was singing songs of praise to God. Any thoughts or comments on the direct command part of this? All right, what about approved example? Again, we'll try to go through these somewhat quickly. Romans chapter 15 and verse 9. This is a quote from the Old Testament, but he brings it in here to the New Testament. And for the Gentiles to glorify God for his mercy, as it is written, therefore I will give praise to thee among the Gentiles, and I will sing to thy name. So here again, we have an example of kind of like that. If we're joyous, we're going to sing. If we're thankful, we're going to sing praises to God, and people are going to hear me singing praises to God. 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 15. What is the outcome then? I shall pray with the Spirit, and I shall pray with the mind also. I shall sing with the Spirit, and I shall sing with the mind, or with understanding also. Right? So if you're playing an instrument of music, do you understand what that instrument is saying? You may know the notes that they're playing, right? And there may be some order to it, but do you know what that instrument is saying? You can shake your head this way. I'll bring back Mo Hafley for a minute. Shake your head this way. No, we don't know what it's saying, right? It's making a noise, and it may be making a beautiful noise, but it's not really saying anything, right? We sing, we say. And so he tells us to sing with the understanding. I think that's an example that he gives us. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 12, again, similar quote, I will proclaim thy name to my brethren. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing thy praise. Here's an example of singing. When Jesus and was getting ready to basically be crucified, he went to the Mount of Olives, and what did they do? Sang a hymn. Right? So again, example after example after example of singing, but no example of playing. So in the direct command, there's never a direct command for us to play. There's not an approved example of us or for us to play an instrument. What about a forced conclusion? So from the direct command or from the approved example, is there a conclusion that we can draw that says, well, here's why we should have instrumental music? It makes sense. Is there any conclusion that we can draw? I don't think from having the absence of a direct command, having the absence of an example, I don't think that there's any way we could force a conclusion that instrumental music is authorized or okay in the eyes of God. I don't know how you would do it, right? If we look at the law of exclusion, the command to do one thing negates the commands to do something else unless we have an example or there's no other option, there's no other way we can understand it. And so I don't think that any of those happens here. So this is where we're going to try to spend the bulk of our time tonight, is trying to answer the question, is it an expedient? So what is an expedient again? All right, it's an aid, right? It helps us to carry out a command. So that's really the only question that we have that we can answer. That's really the only way that instrumental music is going to fall into the category of this is okay, God is okay with this, God authorizes this, isn't it expedient to play along with our singing? Now, again, we might say, well, we're all still singing, right? Is the playing, the accompanying of an instrument, is that helping us with our command to sing? Well, again, we can justify just about anything in that way. Does anybody like jelly? I like jelly. You think it would be appropriate? I think it would aid me in taking of the unleavened bread. I like leaven too. It would aid me in the taking of the unleavened bread to have a little bit of jelly on it, help it go down a little bit easier. Is that an expedient? No, I think we would all say, no, that is absolutely something added to a command to partake of unleavened bread, right? And so again, we can justify just about anything, but is it right in the sight of God? And that's the question that we want to answer. Now, oddly enough, where we're going to go to find the answer to this is in the Old Testament. And I think it's the best place and probably the easiest place to find out whether or not God would think that playing an instrument of music would be an expedient to helping us sing. So, let's head to the Old Testament in 2 Chronicles. Well, actually, before we get there, we're going to go to another, but go to 2 Chronicles chapter 29. Mark that, because we're going to come back to it. A couple things to remember before we get into this. What we are and what we are not talking about. We already mentioned it. We're talking about the collective, not the individual. So I'm not talking about whether you can go home and play your guitar and sing Amazing Grace along, that's not what we're talking about. Our question that we're addressing is can you bring that guitar in here and us worship with it, okay? Different, it's an entirely different conversation, right? So we're going to leave that individual conversation for another time and leave it there. But can we as a group, as collective, can we use those instruments of music in our worship? So that's what we are and what we are not talking about. And there is a difference that we're going to talk about next time, which I've already mentioned. And we've already mentioned, reference 1 Timothy chapter 3. There's a certain way in which we conduct ourselves as far as the church as a group is concerned. So here's a practical example from 2 Samuel chapter 6. Again, this is David. 2 Samuel chapter 6, starting in verse 11. Thus the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Now, does anybody know the context of where we are right now? What has previously happened? Well, it wasn't the Philistines, but, okay, they tried to move the ark, right? And Uzzah touched it. David got upset basically with God because Uzzah died in the moving of it. And so where the ark was at that moment was at the house of Obed-Edom. And so they basically said, we're leaving it here. And David's mad, David's upset. But now they've gone back to go get it, right? Now it was told King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him on account of the ark of God. And David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. And it was so that when the bearers of the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. And David was dancing before the Lord with all his might and was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouting and the sound of trumpet. Now, this is not the collective worship of Israel, okay? They're just moving this artifact that they've always wanted to be. David always wanted it to be in Jerusalem. And David is getting ready to help his son Solomon, right, to build the temple where it's going to stay. But he always wanted to bring it in. And so here they're bringing it in, and David's excited about it, and he's dancing, right? He's leaping, he's twirling. And again, does this authorize us to leap and twirl in our worship and to blow trumpets? No. This is just something that the children of Israel are doing. David is bringing this artifact, this important artifact, into the city, and he gets caught up in the emotion of it. Does anybody remember what his wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, does after this? She sees him. Yeah. So she gets upset with him, and she basically berates him and says, you've embarrassed yourself. Now, I think it was more that she was embarrassed by what David was doing. I don't know, husbands, if you've ever embarrassed your wives, but she was embarrassed by what David was doing, and so she berates him about it. And what was his response? Yeah, that's true too. I heard something. Yeah. He basically tells her, I wasn't doing it for you, right? That was my joy. I was showing my joy to the Lord. Now, again, that's not the collective worship of Israel. That's David being excited in a moment, and he's happy, and so this is what he decides to do. But again, that doesn't authorize us to do this in our worship, nor did it authorize the children of Israel. We don't read anywhere of the collective worship of Israel including this, right? This is just David being caught up in a moment and being excited. And so there is a difference, and I think this example in 2 Samuel kind of shows us that difference of the individual versus the collective. And so, again, let's look at the collective. Now, when we think of music in worship, we tend to think of David, and why is that? Well, again, in 2 Chronicles 29 and verse 25, now this particular account is King Hezekiah, and what King Hezekiah is doing, they have kind of faltered in their worship all throughout their history, basically, from the time of David. And so what Hezekiah is trying to do is get everything back to where it's supposed to be. But notice what he says. He then stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, harps, and with lyres. Remember, now this is, hundreds of years after David first instituted it. Do you think there's different instruments other than the harp and the lyre and the cymbal? After 400 years. Go back in time 400 years from now. Do we have different instruments now than we did back then? Yeah, big time, right? There's a lot. So I'm sure there were advances in music over those 400 some years. But what does Hezekiah do? He says, this is what David authorized. David's command came not from David, but from God. So we're going to stick to what David said. So there's same three instruments. That's why I asked at the beginning, does God even authorize instrumental music in the Old Testament? I don't think he does. I think he authorizes these three instruments in their worship in the Old Testament. So he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, harps, lyres, according to the command of David and of Gad the king's seer and of Nathan the prophet, for the command was from the Lord through his prophets. Not David's idea, not Gad's idea, not Nathan's idea. This is God's plan all along. But we think of David because David is the one that introduced all of this. Now, let me ask a question again about David. Did David ever play an instrument in the temple for the collective worship of Israel? And how do we know he didn't? I think there's two reasons. Hadn't been built yet. Okay, that's reason number one. He couldn't have played in the temple during their collective worship because the temple wasn't built yet. Number two is he wasn't a Levite, right? And that's the only tribe that was authorized to do any of the singing or any of the playing in the collective worship of Israel. So again, if David is singing as an individual or playing as an individual, it's not part of the collective worship of Israel. It's just David being David. All right? So again, just understand people talk about David and think about David, but we have some information now to go to those people that would say, well, David did it. We can say, well, no, not really. Not in the way that you're thinking, right? Yes, he played an instrument. We know he did. He played it for Saul, and there's other times where David played an instrument. He wrote a lot of music. He told them what instruments to use. He wrote down a lot of the lyrics of the songs they were going to sing, but he never sang them. He never played because he wasn't a Levite and the temple wasn't even built yet. So again, that's information, but it was all under the direction of God. So now let's go to 2 Chronicles chapter 29, if you're not already there. I think these are the most important verses when we're talking about instrumental music in our worship and why God might not want instruments of music used in our worship today. I want you to notice a couple of things. All right, starting in verse 25. He then stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, harps, with lyres, according to the command of David and of Gad the king's seer and of Nathan the prophet, for the command was from the Lord through his prophets. And the Levites stood with the musical instruments of David. What were the musical instruments of David? There you go. The harp, the cymbals, and the lyres, right? We don't have to guess. We know what the instruments of David were, right? He's already told us that. And just so you know that it's multiple times, okay, throughout the Chronicles, the Kings, multiple times it uses those three. And so you can backtrack it. It's not just here, but it's those three instruments. Now, he also says, and the priests with the trumpets. Now, again, it's assumed, this is not, biblical fact. This is kind of added later, but it's assumed that it was for kind of putting people in place and like marking out, here's when you start this, here's when you stop this. So it was just a marker for them, okay? All right, so 26, and the Levites stood with the musical instruments of David and the priests with the trumpet. 27, then Hezekiah gave the order to offer the burnt offering on the altar. When the burnt offering began, the song to the Lord began, also with the trumpets accompanied by the instruments of David, king of Israel. So when the burnt offering began, the people started playing the song, the instruments were being played. While the whole assembly worshiped, the singers sang, the trumpets sounded, and all of this continued until the burnt offering was finished. All right, so we play at the start of the burnt offering, at the start of the sacrifice. Then we stop, right, when the sacrifice ends. Do you see how specific God was here? That Hezekiah is being. Here's what David said. We start playing when the sacrifice starts. Then when the sacrifice is over, everybody stops. Right? We're playing with the instruments of David. We're using the harp, the lyre, the cymbals, the trumpet. The priests have the trumpet so they can direct us and tell us what to do and where to go and when to start and when to stop. Okay, all of that happened, and God is very specific here. Then what happens? All right. Now at the completion of the burnt offering in verse 29, the king and all who were present with him bowed down and worshiped. Moreover, King Hezekiah and the officials ordered the Levites to sing praises to God with the words of David and Asaph the seer. So they sang praises with joy and bowed down and worshiped. Now let me ask you something here. If they began to play an instrument of music in their worship, at this point, do you think God's going to be pleased? He didn't tell them to, did he? I don't think God's going to be very pleased. He's being very specific. Right? Do you notice how when the offering began, in verse 27, when the burnt offering began, the song to the Lord began with the trumpets, accompanied by the instruments of David. But when that was finished, King Hezekiah ordered the Levites to sing praises with not the instruments of David anymore, but with the words of David and of Asaph. And so they sang praises with joy and bowed down and worshiped. So there's no instrumental music going on after the burnt offering is over. Right? It started when the burnt offering started. It stopped when the burnt offering stopped. Then, after that, he ordered them to sing. Right? The Levites were to sing praises to God using the words of David. And so they're probably singing some of the psalms that David had written down. Right? No instruments of music were, up until very, very recently, and in very, very few Jewish synagogues, no instruments of music were ever used in synagogue worship of Israel. Why? There was no burnt offering in the synagogue. Where was the burnt offering to take place? In the temple. So because there was no burnt offering in the temple, there was no need for instruments of music in synagogue worship. They sang just like we sing. Something interesting to think about. The earliest that instruments of music were introduced was about 666 A.D., Anno Domini, or in the year of our Lord. So after Christ's death, about 600 years after, and some Christian churches started to begin to try. It was fought for a long time. It wasn't widely used until the 12th century. But even then, it wasn't as widely used as it is today. It was fought and fought and fought until about the 1600s or so. And then it got to be where fewer and fewer people were just singing, worshiping with a cappella music. So when somebody says, well, we've always done it, right? This is the way it's always been. No, it didn't start out that way, and it wasn't that way for a long time. But what happens is we get used to it, right? And so for us, maybe, yes, everybody's doing it and everyone's done it for a long time, but it wasn't that way from the beginning. So again, we have information to pass on to other people when they say, well, everybody does it, right? We've been doing this for a long time. We've been using musical instruments for a long time, but it didn't begin that way, and it doesn't make it right that we're using them now. Do we see again how specific this section of verses is with the collective worship of Israel? So, again, to me, it makes sense that we don't use instruments of music, right? It is. Would you consider what happened in 2 Chronicles an expedient? No, it was a direct command from God to sing and play during the burnt offering, right? And then it was a direct command to sing. And so they could not then turn around and say, well, but the musical instruments will be an expedient. It will help us sing. No, I don't think we want to cross God in that way, that we say, well, we want to continue to use those instruments even though we're not directed to right now. We just used them right here, so why can't we use them right here? What's the answer to that question? Why do they use them during the burnt offering but not after? What's that? Wasn't authorized. That's 100% correct. But why? Why? Why do you think God left it out the second time around when they were just singing? Now, again, historians will say, what happens when an animal is sacrificed? Do you think they come along like willingly and say, yeah, go ahead and slit my throat and drain all my blood? And it's a loud process, right? And so a lot of people suggest that God wanted to maybe drown out some of that sound, and so he authorized musical instruments at that point. But what is the sacrifice? What was its purpose? What was the burnt offering for? Okay, atonement, to cleanse people. Now, let me ask this question. Why wouldn't we do it today? Jesus was our sacrifice. We don't need to sacrifice animals, right? And so look how nicely God says, do this in this section of your worship, but only in this section. Because when my son comes, you're not going to need this section of your worship. Right? We can just take that piece of the worship out. And the New Testament Christians basically followed a lot of the synagogue worship, the style of their worship. And so not that we're exact in that way, but it followed a similar style to where there was teaching and reading of Scripture and prayer and singing, a cappella singing. So it just, again, makes sense when you look at the musical instruments being tied to that sacrificial system. It makes sense that God would want that out, right? Because we have Jesus now. So if we're using instruments of music in our worship, what is that a reminder of? Right? It's a reminder of a time and place when Jesus wasn't here, when Jesus wasn't our sacrifice. Right? It was the time before Jesus even came to the earth, before he was sacrificed. And so, to me, every time an instrument is used in that singing and that worship, it's a reminder to God that there was a time when his son wasn't here, when he didn't atone for the... Why wouldn't we want Jesus to be here, right? Why would we want to go back to a place where Jesus wasn't our sacrifice? And again, I think that's why, to me, it makes sense that God wouldn't want instruments of music in our worship. And I think, as far as the expediency is concerned, I think again, 2 Chronicles 29 kind of tells us that God sees those as two different things. It's not an expedient from one to the other. It's two different commands because God makes two different commands. Play instruments here. Don't play instruments here. Sing here. I hope all of that makes sense. I'm out of time, and there's a lot of other things that I could have gone through, and I knew I wasn't going to get through all of it. Any thoughts, comments, or questions before we close? I hope all of that made sense. I hope I didn't go too awful fast. I know sometimes I have a tendency to do that, especially when I'm trying to get through a lot of information. But thank you for staying patient with me. And Lord willing, I'll see you next time.